In this class today, I'll be teaching how to process and optimize your models for the JigSpace workshop. Now, we are currently in a 3D Blender scene. Blender is a professional 3D modeling software. We'll have a link below, and we will also be featuring the JigSpace Blender template. Now, this is a version of Blender that has had some of the more complex features stripped back so that you just have the tools that you'll need available to you. Now, we're currently in the blend scene. In order to move around the scene, I can press down on the middle mouse button or the scroll wheel, and that just lets me rotate in the scene. I can also pan in the scene by pressing Shift while pressing down that middle mouse button again. And I can also zoom in and zoom out using the scroll wheel. So to start off with, I'm going to bring my model into the scene. So we have our model in the scene, and if I zoom in, you can see that we also have this control in the middle. So what this is a control gizmo that allows us to make rotational, movement, and scale changes to our model. If I go up to the top left-hand corner, I have the ability to select individually the move, rotate, and scale tools, or I can keep on the transform tool, which has all of those available at once. We also have some selecting options. I'm going to press and hold. Now, I always recommend that you choose the select box. This allows you to click on individual models to select them and move them around the scene, but it also lets you click outside the scene and draw a box around your object, and that makes selecting everything a lot more simple. Now, in our scene, we have these guidelines. You'll see that they're very similar to the ones we have in the JigSpace app. They're also a similar size, and this is just a great way for you to identify how big your model is in comparison to the Jig workshop. Now, currently the model is on its side. This is often the case when you bring in a model from CAD software that was initially designed to print it. So I want this to be standing up, and I also want it to be positioned above the ground. As you can see with the guidelines, it's currently sunk inside that floor. So in order for the lighting to look correct in the JigSpace workshop, we like all of our models to be loaded above this floor line. So with my model selected, I'm going to go to the right-hand side and I'm going to rotate my model. Here I can select my axis. In this case, I do want to use the x-axis, and I'll be rotating at 90 degrees. For further reference, the color red represents the x-axis, the green represents y, and the blue is the z-axis. Now in this case, I'm going to rotate 90 degrees on the x-axis, so now it's standing up straight. The next thing I want to do is use our Place Above the Ground tool, and this will lift our model and position it directly above that central point. Now, I'm also aware that the direction we'll be looking at our model in the Jig workshop is facing this way, but there are some details on the other side that I'd like to view. So in this case, I'm going to rotate my model along the z-axis, and I'll be rotating that 180 degrees. So we've got our model facing the correct way. Another feature that I'd like to show is our scale tool. For example, I'll set this to 0.5. That will halve its original size. Often when you bring components into the JigSpace workshop and into Blender, you'll find that your models are too small or too big for your scene. So using this scale tool is a useful way of getting your models to the correct scale you're after. Now in this case, I want to double it from its current scale, and that will get me back to my original scale. So as well as our import, transform, and rotate tools, we also have our structure menu, we have our optimize menu, we have the split, our target, and our export menus. Next, I'll be discussing what our target menus display. So the first thing I want to explore in the JigSpace control panel is your target. So I'm going to scroll down, and as you can see here, we have the number of triangles, the number of vertices, and the number of individual objects that make up the model in this scene. So what we want to do is lower these three numbers as much as possible. You may be wondering what triangles are. In this case, I'm going to select our outer casing and turn on our wireframe. This is inside the structure menu, so I'm pressing show wireframe. And as you can see, the object is made up of a lattice work of different triangles that wrap around to create that overall shape. So as a limit on the triangle count, we like to say at JigSpace to try and stay under 500,000 triangles. And in this case, because it's quite close to that number, I'd like to lower that as much as possible. It's also important to take into consideration how many models you're going to have in the Jig workshop. If you're just featuring this model, you may not need to perform any further optimization, but if you intended to have, for example, 3 of these models in the scene, that would raise the triangle count to about 1,500,000. And then you would start seeing a little bit of performance issues in some of the older devices. Now, speaking of devices, we have the option to swap it from the desktop version to the iPhone 7 to 8. And if I do that, as you can see, we now have a warning letting us know that this triangle count is pushing the limits of the device, and you may experience a little bit of lag when using this object in your scene. So the first thing I want to optimize in my target is the number of objects in the scene. As you can see, I currently have 42 objects, and I want to lower this number. So what I need to do is group some of these objects. To do that, I'm going to select this bar here, and if I zoom in, you can see that it's got an orange highlight around it. That just shows that it's currently selected. And if I press Shift, I can multi-select and join these 3 bars together by going to Structure and then to Join. And now when I press Join, you'll see that the number 42 will be lowered down to 40. Now that these objects are joined in my scene, if I want to move them around in the Jig workshop, as you can see, they'll be treated as a single sub-object. Now, it's important to take this into consideration and think about how you want your objects to be animated and how you want them to be textured or given materials in the Jig workshop. For instance, if I zoom around to the back of this hairdryer here, I have these 2 screws. Now, because I'm not moving them around much in the Jig workshop, and I also want them to have the same silver material, it's inefficient for these to be single objects in my scene. So they're prime candidates to be grouped and joined together. So again, I'm selecting the screw and then pressing Shift in order to multi-select. And with both of them selected, I'm going to Structure and I'll press Join. And again, if you watch the target of the objects, that will be lowered down again. Now, it's important to remember that there are also objects hidden inside this model here. I'm fully aware of those, so I'm going to select this outer casing and press Hide Selected, and that'll reveal for me some of the objects that are hidden inside the hairdryer. So there are a couple more objects in here that I'd like to group together. This is because they share the same material in the Jig workshop, and they also don't move around in my scene. So I'm selecting this box here, and this one here. And again, I'm pressing Join. And now I've hidden some objects in my scene, for example, the outer casing and the barrel to the hairdryer. So what I want to do is show my currently hidden objects. Now if you look over here, it says that there are 2 objects currently hidden. So I'm going to Show All. It's important to always press Show All before exporting your object from the scene to make sure that you have everything selected. So if I scroll down, you can see that we've already gone from 42 objects down to 37. I would recommend when working with your own models that you continue on from here, but for now I'm going to move on to the next section of the optimization process. Sometimes when you import your model into the blend scene, you'll discover that your model is joined together as a single object. So if I move this around, you can see that it's in one piece. In this case, I would recommend starting off by cleaning up your mesh. So I'm going to go to the Optimize menu and press Clean Up Mesh. Next, I'm going to select my model and go into Edit mode. As you can see, we're now in our wireframe. I can go and press 1 in order to show my vertices, press 2 to mainly show my edges, or press 3 to mainly show the faces of this object. For now, I'm just going to keep it on 2 so I can easily see what's happening. So I want to separate out my objects in a similar way to how I was grouping the objects before. So with my cursor hovering over this main casing, I'm going to press L, and as you can see, we've got our linked menu in the bottom left corner. I recommend setting it to the normal setting. So with this selected, I'm going to go into the JigSpace control panel and press Separate. And now when I press Tab or go back into object mode, this outer casing is now separated out from my model, and I'm going to continue on with this so that I can separate out the different parts of my model. So what I need to keep in mind in this situation, as with the grouping I was doing before, I need to consider what materials I want my objects to have and what kind of movement I want them to have in my scene. So the outer casing I want to keep a white plastic, but the end of my hairdryer nozzle is something that I would like to be a dark rough plastic. So it's useful for me to select this and separate it out. So with this selected, I'm going back into edit mode. I can also press Tab, and that lets me go into edit mode too. And again, I'm hovering over this object and I'll press L, and normal is automatically selected because we pre-selected that before. So with this fully selected, I'm going to go to separate. And if I were to press Tab, you can see that this front nozzle piece is now fully separated too. So I would continue on from here and continue separating out my objects until I had them into workable groups for editing in the Jig workshop. Another option we have when you import your model and you discover that it's fully joined together as a single object, for example, if I move this around, you can see that it acts as one group, is that I can go to our edit mode, and if I press A, it'll select the whole object, and we have an option to separate all of the individual meshes in our scene. So if I press this, and I go back to object mode, or I press Tab to go back to object mode, every piece of my mesh is now fully separated, and I can begin the process of grouping my model back together the way I was at the beginning of the class. So it's simply a matter of now selecting my pieces, for example, this outer casing here and this casing here, and I can press join, and they will be joined together as a single object group. So you just need to go around and group these objects. Something to keep in mind again is how you want your objects to have materials in the Jig workshop and how you want them to be able to move in the Jig workshop. So it's always important to keep this in mind when grouping them together. The next thing I want to address in my target is the number of vertices. As you were previously shown, your model is made out of a mesh of triangles laid out to create the shape of your model. Now for every triangle, there are 3 points, and those 3 points are vertices. As you can see, we've currently got 220,000 vertices in our scene. So what I'm going to do is run a script to clean up those vertices. And to do this, I'm making sure that I have every model selected. I'm then going to clean up mesh. And what clean up mesh does is it takes any loose mesh frames and it joins them together correctly. Often when you export a model from different CAD programs, you'll find that flat and curved faces have been designed in a way that they sit next to each other, but they aren't fully connected. And this will raise the overall triangle and vertex count of your object, making it run less efficiently. So by running this script, we're going to improve our overall performance. So keep an eye on the triangles and the vertices. So as you can see, it's gone from 220,000 vertices down to 160,000. So we've already made good progress. So we've addressed both the object count and the vertex count. The next thing I want to tackle are our triangles. So if I turn on our wireframe, you can see from this wireframe the areas that are most dense with triangles. So if I go to the rear of the hairdryer, you can see from this orange how dense it is, and I'll zoom in. Now, despite the density, you can see that these objects are actually quite efficiently designed. And while there are a lot of triangles in this feature, it's also a feature of the hairdryer that I don't want to damage in any way or remove. So I'm actually not going to add any optimization to this shape here. But if you look at the silhouette of the hairdryer, you can see that this rim piece here actually has a lot more detail than it needs. So I'll run some optimization on it. Now to do that, I'm going to the Optimize menu in our Jig control panel, and I'll press Optimize Selected Mesh. Here we have a ratio slider. Now to start off with, I'm going to begin dragging it down. And you can see the optimization happening to the mesh. And if I go down to 0, as you can see, it gets a little bit crunchy. Now, when I work with the ratio slider, what I like to do is start off at 0.1, which is an optimization of 90%. And I like to have a look at the overall shape. Now, to look at the shape itself and the lighting that's affecting it, I'm going to hide this object's wireframe. And you can see here, we've got some creasing happening that's affecting the shadows of our object. So what I want to do is recalculate my normals. It's automatically set to 27, and I would generally recommend keeping it at that. So I've recalculated my normals, and despite this being at a ratio of 10% in the number of polygons it used to have, you can see that the overall shape hasn't really been affected. Something I am keeping in mind though is I'm looking for any hard edges. So you can see there are some here and in this corner here. So what I want to do is raise up the ratio a little bit at a time. So from 0.1, I'm going to go to 0.2. And you can already see that some of those hard edges on this lip here have already been removed. But if I look carefully, there's still a few more. So I'm going to raise it to 0.3. And there's just a little bit of creasing up here that I'd like to remove. So I'll try it at 0.4. And overall, it's smoothed it out quite nicely. And I'm pretty happy with the overall shape. So I'm going to hit apply. But before I do that, I thought I'd just show you. At a ratio of 1, we have 340,000 triangles. But when I lower this down to a ratio of 4, it's down to 327,000 triangles. So we've lowered our triangle count by running this ratio. So if I hit apply, we've lowered the overall triangle count of our model here, but there is some more work that we could do. And if I press tab, I can see that the mesh has changed and it's looking a lot more messy, but you won't be able to see those lines when working in the Jig workshop. So the overall shape is what counts in the end. Now I'm conscious that this switch here is also a very high polygon object. It's got a lot of triangles in the scene and a lot of edge loops that aren't adding to the overall shape of the object. So I'm going to select it. I'm going to hide its wireframe just so that as I run this optimization, I'm going to be basing the ratio slider on what I see visually. So if I start off at 0.1, you can see it's getting some strange shadow information here. So again, I'm recalculating my normals. What recalculating normals does is it takes the lighting information from your object and recalculates the lighting in our blend scene. Often when objects are exported from CAD programs, the lighting is baked in. So that's why when we run our optimization, we're finding that it's creating those shadowy artifacts. So with our normals recalculated, I can see there are some hard lines in our scene. I'm going to clean those up by raising up our ratio to 0.2, but I can still see some on this edge in here. So I'll try that at 0.3. And it's looking pretty good. There are some hard lines here. Generally, I would say that they're so small they're unlikely to be visible, but just to be safe, I could raise it up to 0.4 and you can see it's a lot smoother. So I'll hit apply. And something to remember to keep in mind is we also have objects hidden inside our hairdryer. So I'm going to press hide selected and I'll press hide selected again. And now we can have a look at the shapes inside our hairdryer model. So with these wires here, you can see that a lot of the wires have edge loops that aren't contributing to the overall line of this shape here. So it's a perfect candidate for us to run a bit of cleanup and optimization. So I'm going to scroll down. Our triangle count has gone from 400,000 down to around 300,000. So we've already made some great progress. We've lost about 100,000 triangles. I'm going to perform some more on this one here. So I'll press optimize and we're going to go from 291 down to 235. So that's made a considerable reduction. But I can see that a couple of these have hard edges, so if I view them in object mode without our wireframe, you can see there are some unusual shapes here. So I'm going to raise that up to 0.2. Already you can see that it's looking a lot cleaner. These shapes are looking pretty consistent, so I'm happy with that, and I'll press apply. So we've gone from the top 400,000 triangles down to around 250 triangles. 250,000 triangles. So we're making great progress. I would tell you to continue on until you're happy with the overall shapes of your objects, but you've lowered the triangle count as low as possible. Another useful feature of the JigSpace control panel is the ability to show backface culling. I'm going to select that now. So our model now appears to have a different material on it, but another thing that it's also revealed is if I zoom in and go down, this piece at the bottom of the hairdryer appears to be transparent. It's as though I'm looking through the object to the other side of it. Now, this is caused when an object's normals are flipped. So in order to fix this, I'm going to select this object and go to my Optimize panel and press Flip Normals. And now these are facing the correct way, and they'll also face the correct way in the Jig workshop. The next feature I'd like to show is the JigSpace Split tool. So if I go to the Control panel and scroll down, we have our Split tool here. I just want to remove the outer casing or shell of the hairdryer to reveal those internal components. So in order to do that, I'm just going to select my outer casing. I'm then going to choose an axis on which to run my split, in this case the y-axis. And as you can see, I have this arrow here, and I can use that to move my plane around and choose where I want that cut to go through. In this case, I want it to go right through the middle. So with that prepared, I'm going to press Split Selected Mesh. And now my mesh is split in half. I can select this outer casing and pull it aside to reveal those internal components. This can be incredibly useful if you want to achieve cutaways in your own models, to reveal your internal components and discuss how your model works. In this case, it's also important to remember that by cutting this model into two objects, I've added another object to my object count, and I've also increased the number of triangles and vertices in my scene. But if I find that it's worth it, this can be a very useful tool. So I'm pressing Ctrl-Z to move my model back into position. Now the next thing I'd like to do with my model fully optimized with an improved triangle, vertice and object count is I'd like to export it. Something to always keep in mind when exporting your files is to go to the Show All button. This will just make sure that every object in your scene, including the ones that may have been hidden at the time, are fully selected and fully visible. This ensures that you don't leave anything out when exporting your models from the scene. So now I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to select my folder. That's the one I want. And give my file a name. And I'm going to export my mesh. And now I can bring my model into the JigSpace workshop. So now that our model has been fully optimized, grouped, and positioned, I'm ready to bring it into my JigSpace scene. So I'm going to the left-hand side and I'll import my CAD file. And now my CAD file is loaded into its scene. I'm able to move it around as though it's a single object because of how we exported it out as one object, but by separating out my models or combining them into their selected groups, if I go to sub-object mode, I'm able to select the individual pieces or meshes that make up my model. So if I add another step, for example, I completed the split through my model on this outer casing. So if I pull it aside and go to the color palette and lower its transparency, or turn up its transparency, you can see that I'm able to achieve smooth transitions that reveal these internal components. When I want to give my models materials, I'm able to select them, go to the materials section, and scroll down till I find the right material. They're also able to be given different colors, and the objects that I've grouped together, for example, these bars here, move as a single group. The same can be said for the screws at the rear of the hairdryer. They work as a single object group, and they also receive the same materials when I apply a material to that group. Now if I zoom in, you'll see that they're both a shiny silver color. So not only have I improved or optimized my model by joining these pieces into groups, improving its overall performance, I've also cleaned up the model considerably, lowering the number of triangles. So this model should run a lot smoother on some of the older devices.